Harris and Harris Group is a public company, so there's a safe harbor statement. But I really wanted to start with taking a pretty big step backwards and sort of talking about the different perspectives that we sort of try to keep a pulse on a day-to-day basis. And then they all kind of converge in terms of topics that we're interested in. And so we look at global trends. I mean, these are pretty broad stroke, increase in cost of healthcare, there's many subcategories under that, distributed care, point of care, electronic records, just new and novel analytics, concierge medicine, lots of different trends there. Increase in population really gets to food and energy, and just huge increase in data and network communication. So sort of what's going on in the big macro trends. We also really try to build relationships with corporations like many that you work with, because you have a pulse on the market. You are the ones that will be implementing the technology, I think, as we heard a lot today. And you're the customers for a lot of what we do. And so understanding what your needs are really important, because we've invested in a lot of companies that, at the end of the day, no one really cared. It was really interesting technology and it worked, but it wasn't solving a problem that was, integratable into industry. And then on sort of the third axis, we spend a lot of time at universities, and we spend a lot of time building relationships with professors who we think are maybe their research isn't commercializable today, but we think it might be in the future, and it sort of is triangulating on some of these other pieces as to what we're hearing about through corporations and what we're hearing about, or what we're reading in the news, or what we're trying to keep a pulse on. And so what kind of starts to bubble up are these areas of technology that start to converge, and we've heard a lot about them, and these are some of the things we've already invested in, but we see a lot about omics, bioelectronics, what's happening at the interface of semiconductors and bioanalytics, and so on and so forth. But I just wanted to start there, because I think you'll see, and I'll try to highlight some of these points along the way, that it's not just, it's not a linear approach. It's very much like gathering a lot of different information and sort of honing in on what might be a really interesting investment, and then how do you build that company. So I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to Harris and Harris Group, just to give you some perspective on where I'm coming from, our innovation ecosystem, and talk about some of the markets that we've invested in, both in the past, currently, and what we see for the future. Give a couple of examples from our portfolio to give you a little bit of a perspective on kind of how we think about or how we identify specific investments, and wrap up from there. But really, we build companies from disruptive science. So we really consider ourselves company builders. At the end of the day, we're deploying money. We are investors. But we think about it in terms of how do you translate what's going on in science into a product, and kind of being that bridge. We have a pretty straightforward business model. We're a little different than other venture groups. We don't have a fund. We're publicly traded. We have an evergreen structure, which basically means we invest money into innovative ideas. We build value, and then hopefully that ends up in a monetization event, where we can return money back into our company and redeploy that money into new investments. And so we call this an evergreen structure. We've been recognized as leaders in investing in technology. We've been doing this for 30 years. And we've built successful companies, just to make the point that, companies, whether it's the public markets or corporations, do find value in sort of what we're investing in over time. And really, we're building a portfolio of innovative companies. This graph highlights, some of the events we've had, some of the ones we think are coming up, some of our more mature portfolio. And then in the box, to the right are some of the companies that we are really early, still a little bit too early to know what's going to happen with those, but we continue to work with them and try to build value in those. So if we talk about the innovation ecosystem, and I think it's relevant to a lot of the discussion here, we see a lot of the university relationships, like I talked about, and also the corporate relationships. And I think a couple of trends that we're seeing currently is that this bridge of early stage money is just getting it's just not there. And we're kind of there's a handful of groups that do this, we're one of them. But what we're finding is that universities are starting to step up to the plate a little bit and allocate money for commercialization. So they're moving a little bit closer to commercialization. And I think corporations realize that because of what's going on in the venture world, which is basically not as much money and therefore not as many potential pipeline products, they're really moving their view to a lot more early stage and thinking about interfacing with earlier stage companies and directly with universities. And I think what's interesting is that both sides are getting closer and closer together, and so that bridge is actually becoming smaller. And I think it gives a lot more opportunity for groups like ours that kind of invest $5 to $7 million per deal, it's not $50 million, to really help move these technologies to the next level. I think it's pretty clear what the universities bring, what the corporations bring, and sort of how we sort of help be the glue there. And this isn't to read, but I think, again, from the perspective of talking and building relationships and talking to a lot of different types of groups, you start to see the themes, and you start to see that technology areas that might be obvious to like a pharma really span the gamut. I mean, I think, again, just to use, like genomics as an example, and I'll talk a little bit more about metabolomics. It's not just about healthcare, it's about anything that has DNA. So clearly there's a lot of ag, and then you think about how do you actually measure that. I think there's a lot of new materials and electronics and other instrumentation that gets pulled into that. And so even if, when we think about it, it's not just the output, it's also about the instrumentation, innovation, and all of those disciplines really coming together. So here I think, I took the time to sort of write in some examples, but I think it's interesting that you can really find a lot of commonality across these platform technologies. And when we talk to corporations, I think that really resonates, and I think they realize that. For instance, when we talk to ag tech and like the Monsantos and Syngentas, a lot of the work that's been done in healthcare easily ports over, and it's actually at a much more mature state. So I think if you're coming at it at a different point in time, you can actually benefit from a lot of investment that's already gone into some of these technologies. I just spent a couple minutes on this slide just to give you a little bit of perspective on kind of the company building aspect and the investment aspect, just to, I think, round out this concept of investing in early stage and kind of what are the challenges and why aren't there that many people in it. If you look at, so the x-axis is time and the y-axis is money, both cost and value. And so if you look at the red curve, and if you look up into the first dotted line, what that's saying is, with a modest amount of capital invested into a technology, you can de-risk that technology and you can increase the value of that. And that's a good place to be when those two lines are sort of, when the gap is bigger. What happens is, once you de-risk the technology, you really head into scale and manufacturing, and you end up needing to invest a lot more money, and you're not necessarily creating a lot of value until you can really hit the market. And what we find is, I think early stage investors tend to do that first part really well, and that middle part not so well. And that's when we're really looking to partner with corporations and really value that input, and not really even in that middle section, but actually a lot earlier on, because the decisions that we make in sort of building the technology and the experiments we do and the data we generate, we could do the most brilliant experiment, but if it's sort of the wrong data set for you, you have to go back and do it again anyway. So I'm a big proponent of getting partners involved, the customers, involved as early as possible to get that perspective in whatever form that is, whether it's just a discussion, whether it's a project, whether it's an investment, whether it's some other kind of collaboration. But I think I don't think everyone totally sees that bimodal piece of the value creation, and I think it's an important aspect when we think about innovation. So let's talk about some of the transformative markets. And when I say past, I don't mean past, I mean we made these investments probably 10 years ago. So when we were looking at solid state lighting, I mean, these investments were probably made in the '04 timeframe, when you really weren't talking about LEDs. And so I think these are examples, as I was talking about, kind of when we're looking at the trends and talking to corporations and talking to academics, these are the types of things we had identified, kind of back in the early, mid-2000s. So like BioVex and immuno-oncology got bought by Amgen in 2011. You hear a lot about it now. That investment, it was pretty old at the time, but a good outcome. And Solazyme, I mean, that investment was made, I think, in the '04 timeframe, really looking at synthetic biology and producing oils via fermentation for lots of kids. I don't think synthetic biology was really like what people called it, back when we invested. So I think it's interesting to kind of go back historically and look at, were we in the right spaces or not, and can we kind of continue those trends? And if you look at what are we investing in now, we spend a lot of time thinking about the microbiome, and I think we come out on a new medicine side, like that's hard, even though there are some companies that are really tackling it. So we've kind of approached it from another point of view. We do, a lot of our companies generate a ton of data, and so the concept of machine learning is really interesting, and I think the crosstalk between our portfolio companies is also a really interesting discussion, and regenerative medicine. And I'll highlight 4 of these companies in subsequent slides just to give you a little more detail, so I won't spend too much on this one. And then, what's the future? I think these are just a handful. Actually, the transcriptomics is interesting because there was a lot of talk about proteomics, both on the mass spec side, but also, kind of the older 2D gel technology. And I think, I'll talk about our investment in Metabolon, which is metabolomics, and clearly genomics is, already mature, but this area of the transcriptome or proteomics and kind of what's next there, I think is interesting. I also personally think the mechanobiology, and what do I mean by that? We're used to thinking about signals to the cells as chemicals, but I think as we get more mature on kind of the feature size that we can control, the mechanical signaling to cells is pretty interesting, and I think there's a lot that's going on in that space, and I think it'll be just a really interesting space to watch. So just to highlight a couple of examples, and again to try to give you an idea of how we think about these types of technology trends and how we think about an investment. So D-Wave, quantum computing, we've been in this company, maybe over 10 years ago. So at the time, they hadn't even proven it was quantum yet, and so it was pretty risky. It's a big deal. Knock on wood, it'll be successful. They're working with a lot of, major companies now. But, the idea is that if you have a complicated problem to solve that is looking at many solutions and trying to find the optimum one, classical computing can just take forever, and so a quantum approach can help you get there. And so, D-Wave is one that we look at that could be a really big, a really big success, if it can really get there. But the point is, it was pretty risky. It's still a pretty risky investment, and there's an element of just being able to take that risk and try to build it and demonstrate the utility. I mentioned Metabolon a couple times, I think a lot because it's thematic, I think, in some of the other discussions today. When we were looking at Metabolon, and I think most of you are probably familiar, so it's really looking at the biochemical space. A lot of you may know this company. There was a lot of investment going on in genomics, and we sort of took a look at that and said, that's a pretty busy space. What would be the next? How should we think about the next piece? If we weren't going to do a genomics platform, what else would make sense? And we really thought measuring biochemicals and the simplicity of mass spec approach was a way to go. And again, this deal, I think we invested in the mid 2000s, and now they really have a growing business. I mean, 30+ million a year in revenue. And a growing diagnostics business, and they continue to build. But again, just wanted to highlight the way we sort of think about when something comes in and we evaluate it, how does it sort of How does it fall into the total landscape? And is it something that's kind of here and now? Is it saturated? Is it something too far out? Sometimes we're just too early and it doesn't really work out. But this was a little bit of a bet on what comes after genomics, what's going to be complementary. And I think that's actually really playing out, that the biochemical profile with the genomic profile is quite valuable. AgBiome is a more recent investment. And this one came about because we did kind of a landscape analysis, so different from some of the other examples. And we sort of said, what's going on in ag tech? It wasn't really our bread and butter. Seemed to have a lot of interesting trends in terms of, sensing and looking at farming and technology, but also looking at, novel chemicals for the soil, but also looking at sort of the microbial populations and sort of circling back to the other trends when we were talking about the microbiome. As we were looking at ag tech, the microbiome of the roots came up as a potential area, and we said that could be really interesting because it sort of takes a couple of the different themes that we were interested in and kind of marries them. And so AgBiome is an interesting, pretty big investment at the beginning, both on the financial side, but several corporate investors, but really trying to identify microbial solutions for crop protection, but also looking at novel traits through evaluating the microbes. And then the final one I wanted to highlight is Terra Biosystems. This one is actually how I met HESI because of the SIPA program. So actually the whole cardiac physiology was the theme. This one came about, again, totally different. Had been really interested in tissue engineering, really interested in the concept of 3D biology, trying to figure out where the interesting markets might be. Didn't really think that an in vivo approach or a therapeutic approach was going to be kind of in the near term, 10 to 20 years. So it's what else? The in vitro approach seemed to be interesting. And so really started to try to, learn about where the need was. And it became pretty clear. It was on the cardiac side. It was everything that SIPA is doing. It was totally coincidental, by the way. I had no idea that initiative was going on and that we were looking to commercialize a human stem cell cardiomyocyte 3D mature tissue platform. And so that's what we're doing. This one's actually nicely brings together a lot of these relationships. The two founders are out of universities. One's out of Columbia University, one's out of the University of Toronto. They've been collaborating for over 10 years. On this concept. And then a lot of the early diligence we did, and now potential customers are really coming from the industry relationships. And that's been really wonderful to see kind of it's because you get pretty candid feedback on where the real need is and what are the experiments and what are the data that we need to produce to really demonstrate that this is interesting. I also think it's just a nice point of contact for here because it's, again, I think it's kind of interesting that we're looking at innovation from an investment point of view, and you guys are looking at innovation and problem solving from kind of coming at it from a different point of view, and this one sort of is completely aligned. And I feel like some of the other discussions today, there's probably other technology that has nice overlap. And that we'd probably just think about it a little bit differently. I think it's interesting. And then, so personally, where I think there's just a lot of opportunity is in, we call it biology plus, but it's really this concept of what's happening at the interface between biology and other disciplines. And I think that for the past 10, 20 years, there has been multidisciplinary centers set up in universities that, probably at the beginning, they were just making nanoparticles, and it's wow, I can make a nanoparticle, and it's okay, so what? So what are you going to do with it? Or I can make these features, and they put cells on it, and they do something. But I think fast forward, there's some really interesting relevant commercializable like applications coming out of this. So for instance, in cell therapy, you need to activate the cells. I think there's some mechanical approaches to do that through novel materials and actually just those interactions and the forces and the stresses put on those cells. And it goes on and on, but I think this is where we're spending a lot of time looking. We're looking at these interfaces. Terra, back to that, the technology is really looking at maturing the cells through forces, through a novel material, plus the electrical stimulation. So it's bringing together different types of technology to sort of address this problem. But I think this is where we're focused, and I think it'll be interesting to see like how some of these technologies start to dovetail with some of the problems you're trying to solve. And I think a lot of them, just to go on about the analysis, I think the other big area that's really, I would call it here and now, but it's probably not actually here and now in terms of a market standpoint, but looking at the semiconductor industry and what they've been able to do on the chip side and how that'll increase the throughput on the bioanalysis. And I think that's starting, and I think that's only going to get bigger. It gets to then how do you deal with all that data and so on and so forth. But I think that's interesting. And then just to conclude, kind of back to this, I think, I hope I've given you some perspective on, it's not, like I said, it's not a linear process. It's not like, okay, let's go find this deal and invest in this and find this CEO and do this. It's very, I don't want to call it organic, but it's a lot of talking to different people, trying to keep a pulse on what's going on, and then trying to think about when is the right time to form a company and how can you demonstrate value in that kind of out of the gate. But it really starts with the technology, and it really starts with the innovation, and starts with the researchers. And on the other side, it's really kind of what's the market pull coming on the other side. So thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions or talk at the break.
We can like her, I'll shout. Thanks, Misty. So I wonder, as you're working with these groups and you're exploring the development of a new technology, and you talked a lot about bringing the academic environment and the business environment, do you ever, in any of those initial discussions or during that process of development, do you ever engage either academic or government groups to talk about questions when you think about the downstream market uses of this, questions around how will we assure safety of it, or how will we assure reproducibility of results? Are those kinds of questions that you all are interested in, or do you see that as strictly a sort of a downstream set of issues to be dealt with?
So we definitely think about them at the very earliest stages. It's probably not our primary concern. Our primary concern is really about what are the, how do you demonstrate the true value of it? And then we go on. We did a lot historically. We invested in nanotechnology, and it's really fundamentally, what's going on at the molecular level. That question would a lot. It would come up a lot earlier just because of some of the discussions going on, and so we would engage with either policy groups or groups that were thinking a lot about that kind of from a public sector standpoint. But yeah, and actually just to follow on really quick, what's interesting about SIPA as it relates to Terra Biosystems, really what the standards become or what recommendations are really important, because if the outcome is like the whole industry wants to see this set of data and we're doing that set, that's not really helpful. So if we can be aligned as early as possible, I think that only helps the business and helps kind of showing the relevance. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with Metabolon and definitely their technology, which would be in the same bucket as transcriptomics or any of the other omics. So when you invest in somebody like that, and it's going to take some time to, say, get some scientific publications out there just to make the connection between the technology itself and what it's useful for, how does Harrows help push that market acceptance? Are you passive, or do you What do you go out there and do?
So what we'll do is try to make as many introductions as possible and try to help bridge, bring our network to the company. So with Metabolon, we invested when it still was like no one really knew what metabolomics. It sounded like just some random word, so it was like who are the groups that will get it right away? So I didn't really talk about my background, but I was a biochemical engineer at Merck and Company for a long time in their bioprocess group, and fermentation people really understand the value of measuring metabolites because they're trying to monitor what's going on in their fermentation. And so early on in Metabolon, it was like, look, if you want to go to the groups that get what you're doing right away, they're measuring 5 things, you can measure like hundreds, thousands of things. And so they weren't really tuned into that because it's not that it's really niche, but it's a little bit niche, and kind of bringing together kind of the awareness, and then they were able to follow on and go to all the companies to those groups. So that's just one example, but that would be typical, or what we would try to do.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
So I was at University of California, Davis last week, and it was a lot of innovative technology that they were talking about that had to do with genomics and biotechnology. And I was struck by how befuddled the academics were with trying to get traction on some of their ideas. Mm-hmm. Had I known about the Harrows Group, maybe I would have mentioned your name or something. What would you tell, or how do you let these innovative individuals know where you are and what they can get?
It's hard. I mean, we're like a 4-person group. I mean, we're like 10 people total, and we're public. I think it takes like more than half of our company to like file our financials every quarter. But and so that part's hard, the bandwidth and kind of the exposure. I mean, I'm based in New York City, and I can barely kind of get the word out to the 8 or 9 universities, right there. But we try. So some of it, is like speaking here or speaking at academic conferences. Some of it's word of mouth. But it's hard because you can't be everywhere. I think that the hardest groups to reach sometimes are the professors directly. Sometimes it's entrepreneurs, and I think the reason is partly because sometimes while we try to build relationships directly with the individual researchers where we think might be a good match, the tech transfer offices are also like a clearinghouse for some of that too. So sometimes we might visit a university, we'll visit the tech transfer office, and sometimes we might not even know, it might not reach through to some of those specific professors who might have something. So that part's hard to kind of, the many to few sort of problem. But we're always open to talking to people.
So I had a question, a comment. We did a piece of work over the last year or so, working with academics to help them understand the intrinsic value in the ideas that they were developing. And those could be anything from new technology to perhaps a new molecule for drug development. Mm-hmm. But there was a huge mismatch in perception between the venture capitalist perception of value and the academics, which led to a lot of misunderstanding and mistrust, with the academic feeling that they'd been done over and no one understood how good it was, and the venture capitalists failing to understand the potential. Yeah. So there's a graphic in a journal, I can't remember which one, that shows in the early discovery phase of a new technology, there is a huge mismatch with the person who's had the idea overvaluing it. And I think there's something we can be done there. You said we're coming at this a different angle, but we're actually trying to invest in the right projects to extract value out of the limited resources that this organisation has. So there's a coming together. I think
this is the hardest discussion. When you find something that's great and it's going to be a win-win success if you can get it off the ground. This is the hardest discussion. My husband's a professor, so I kind of live the. How personal your research is, as an academic. It's super personal, and you spend decades and you're raising your money to do it, and you come along and some investor wants to do it, and they're like, it's like 10% or something. So I think, so this is, This is a hard one. I think there's three pieces, and an early stage company isn't going to survive without them. And one is the technology and the wealth of intellect and research that's gone on there. The second is the entrepreneur, or the person who's going to like build the company. And that could be the research, usually not, but that person really, who's going to get it off the ground. And then the capital, without the money, there's no company. So I think what I've tried to do, and this has been an iterative approach, is to try to position I might get into too much detail here, but to try to position the ownership of the company to reflect the stage that it is. So at time zero, the researchers probably do own much of the value kind of in that first part. Over time, that starts to shift maybe between the capital and the entrepreneurs and the new team that comes in and how that gets translated. And so I think there's a little bit of, I personally think it's a hard discussion at time zero. I think over time it becomes a little bit easier because the different pieces of value kind of come into the mix. But it's, there's billions of deals that don't happen because of this issue, like billions. Billions of dollars that don't get invested because of this issue.
So I really can share the sentiment about the stage of the investment, including particularly the second stage on manufacturing capability and scalability. Because of the cell therapy, the general medicine industry, right? Now, early stage, a lot of excitement and everything, but now they really have to deliver. And then this manufacturing capability and the scalability really become an issue because, you couldn't really reduce the cost of goods. So from Harrows experience, do you have any kind of framework or guiding principles to really guide the companies to go through that difficult stage?
We recommend partnering. Because at the end of the day, most of these companies are not going to manufacture their product, and I think they can go down that road, and they might be able to get to some early process, but they're not taking into, especially if it's a regulatory issue, they're not taking into just everything that I'll speak for pharma, everything that pharma does during the later stages of development, particularly process development, and how do you release a product and all of that. They just don't, it's not their world. And so, we either try to partner or bring in, just really bring in the management expertise that's done it before. So that, because in that, I drew that curve a little bit generously. A lot of times the value goes down and the cost goes up, like those curves cross, and that happens a lot, and that's not good. And the worst part, it doesn't happen so much in life science because I think life science is it's not a commodity industry, but we've invested in a lot of commodities, and that piece is actually even more critical because if you really waste the money, we have a lot of really good companies that produce really, really good products that are really bad investments because it took too long and too much money. And so that middle kind of piece is, kind of the most critical.
Since you got your toe in the water with microphysiological systems around Terra Biosciences, I wonder if you'd be willing to answer a question on a dynamic on the business models that seem to be developing. As the engineered systems get more and more complex, and the devices themselves with the flow and detection systems get more complex, they've got to be done at the provider. So the cost goes up. A lot of farmers now trying to, are with that cost, seem to say they would position them around a point in development where you've got, or close to having, data the FDA would require to go to the clinic. So I'm beginning to wonder how you use the data. Because the system it's not a screening system anymore. It's actually a system where you can do a few compounds to probabilize safety, yet the vision was these would be screening systems, yet the cost doesn't support a volume of screening that actually allows you to run it in a cost-effective way if the technology is so complex, it has to be done at the provider. Have you tracked that? Are you seeing
Yeah.
that dynamic
Well,
developing in the field?
Yes. In fact, the hardest thing with this one is a business model. And let's just say we've had discussions with 10 to 20 large pharma. So what comes back is a couple fold. One is some of the companies just don't want to touch it. They would want a CRO. We're happy to outsource, we're happy to send it out. And so then the burden is, okay, you need to make sure you're buttoned up on the small company side to be able to produce reliable data. And where's that data going? Is it just for research purposes? Is it going into a filing? I mean, so different groups might want different things. And so how much accountability do you need to have, and where it's only a couple person company, resource-wise, how do you balance that? On the other hand, there are companies that just want it tomorrow. We want to just teach us how to do it. We want to try it out. We want to integrate it. How much they're willing to pay is a whole different question. And I think some of the comments also are exactly what you're saying, is even though people want high throughput screening, I think what people have, there are some high throughput screens that have low content or insufficient content. And so what I'm hearing more is that if you can produce high content, I'm willing to be not so high throughput. Again, how much are there? Yeah, so then it's like, what's that? And then that becomes how much are our costs, to do this. So with this particular one, the instrument, it's pretty simple. I'm not going to say it's super cheap, but it doesn't have fancy instrumentation. Most of it's off the shelf from a analysis standpoint by design, so that it's not we're not going to make an instrument. It's more about the platform, the technology to make the tissue, and some of the pieces around that. But I think the business model is hard. So that's why, we didn't talk about this, but early stage investors, there's not that many anymore. There's a couple really big funds, and they're not going to take business model risk. So you can take all different kinds of risk, and there are just some risks you're not willing to take. And a lot of the bigger funds, if you have a big fund, you have to go for the big win. So you're going to go for therapeutics, you're going to go for some. And so some of these types of technologies, where they can be actually really good businesses and they can be good investments, because of these other pieces of risk, it's hard to find capital. So what we try to do is we try to de-risk that and write super capital efficient. So I'm getting this one off the ground. I mean, I can't do it forever, but it means they don't have to pay a CEO, and we don't have to waste the seed investment on hiring a lot of expensive people who could be really valuable, but we can bring them as an advisors, or we can do different, more creative things while kind of the day-to-day. But this is and I'd be interested, we can talk later, but I'd be interested in if people have ways that they have found that works. Because one of the questions I always ask when talking to pharma is like, how have you worked with companies like this? How have you worked? Because there's clear interest, and it's sort of, how do we work together in a way that's win-win? So to be continued.
So you sort of slid into the area that I was interested in probing a little bit. One of the great life lessons I got was when we got a golden retriever puppy. The trainer who was really training us said, never punish the dog for doing what it's bred to do. And it occurs to me that there are at least 3 sets of interests in public-private partnerships when you're talking about universities, private companies, and investors. And that leaves a very big gap in the middle where there's lots of room for misunderstanding, and certainly from the academic side, the sector I come from, professors live in an area of certainty. We have, some would say, maladapted to a system in which the NIH feeds us, and we're really good at writing those grants, and we're upset when we don't get them, but we just resubmit them. And so the uncertainty, and now we can keep resubmitting them. But the uncertainty that, and then the discomfort that then is engendered when you're moving into an area or into an area in which your idea may or may not survive due to factors beyond your control is really unsettling. So have you thought about what structures could be built in that sort of tripartite partnership that could be scaled up so that the lessons learned could be sort of scaled up across the nation and maybe internationally as best practices for moving ideas out of the academy and into the private space?
Yeah, it would be great. I wish there was, I think we're still trying to figure out if there's a recipe approach. And a lot of it is because I think it comes down to personalities and just where the anxiety lies. And for the most part, I think it's mostly, you know, if you're the inventor, you know, it's, you know, again, it's for the most part, it's people's life work. And to see that move beyond their control is really difficult, even though it's what they want and they don't actually want to leave, to your point, kind of what they know. And so there's a point where you have to kind of let go a little bit. And I think at least what I try to do is kind of titrate that, I don't know, it's called separation. I don't call it separation because you're never really separating, but where you have other people making decisions, but not on day one. I think if you do it on day one, that's hard. And I think it just sets it up for, you know, potential mistrust and always just like it's a pretty negative. And so I think a lot of it, I think the trick is how do you keep the relationship very positive between the entrepreneur, the investor, and the researcher, the inventor, where everyone feels valued. And then over time, I mean, even as an early stage investor, you know, at a certain point, we become much more marginalized because the new investor is going to come in and put in a lot more money, and it's sort of, we go through kind of a similar psychological dilemma, which is like, okay, well, we've built this company, but we can't take it to the next step, and so we need to have this group come in, and then we're not going to have as much influence, or we're worried we won't be able to keep it on the same trajectory. It's the same idea, it's just at a different kind of passing the baton. But, you know, at the end of the day, if you want to build a real company and you want to, you know, it's sort of a decision. Do you want something that's an extension of your lab, or do you want to build a company? And you can do either one. Like, it's okay, but one's going to be a company and one's not. And I think everyone wants to have a company, or a lot of people who go down this road, and I think it's hard to project exactly what that means. So just an anecdote. So my husband's a professor at Columbia. He studies traumatic brain injury, like total, you know, creation of knowledge is his like raison d'etre. And so he comes home and is like, oh, one of my neuroscience colleagues wants to build a helmet, and he wants to enter into this commercialization grant thing. And I was like, awesome, that's great. And so he goes to the session, he comes home, he's like, what's a stakeholder? And I'm like, yeah, okay. So why don't you get a glass of wine and I'll tell you. And then he's like, what do I say to the stakeholders? I'm like, yeah, okay, we'll figure it out. So it's just kind of funny, and but then, you know, kind of watching them go through it. But it takes a lot of hand holding. I think the investors that don't hold the hand, that it's like it can just be kind of a disaster.
But surely that's the space where value can be created. In helping us in the academy understand what to expect and when. So very few of us in the academy understand the difference between an idea and a concept hardening, pivoting, and launching. And we just sort of conflate it all and then are terribly disappointed and run away from you the next time we see you.
Actually, I think it's a good point. There are two discussions that are really important. And honestly, there's one lecture I give sometimes, and it's not even to academics, it's to new entrepreneurs. And it's about capitalization tables, it's about dilution, it's about price per share, and it's about what happens to your common stock and what's preferred. And to be honest with you, if you start a company and don't know those things, I mean, 1 million people do, it's no one's gonna, you have to learn it. It's not something you pick up along the way. And that same conversation maybe in a more relevant and appropriate discussion, I think it's the same issues for the academics. It's the same discussion, maybe just a little less, but I mean the mechanics are actually good because the math isn't that complicated. But there's some really simple examples that can highlight and highlight in advance of it all happening to know what to expect. And it's interesting. I haven't had them like in a group setting with professors, mostly because, well, I think that those forums exist more and more, but with new CEOs, it's sort of like how many people know what preferred stock is, and people don't know. And it's like, okay, well, if you're going to raise a Series A financing, you should really, we should talk about that. So.